Okay, we should be live now.
A main speaker, and then other researchers will do some comments and suggestions and questions. So this time we have Glenn Carruthers from Charles Sturt University. He's a philosopher and he works on consciousness and the feeling of embodiment. And he's going to talk today about the out-of-body experience and the implications that this kind of experiences have for theories of consciousness. And then we have in the panel discussion Alejandro Murillo, who is a philosopher also working on the same topics as Glenn, consciousness and feeling of embodiment, bodily awareness. He works at the Universidad Agustiniana in Colombia, in Bogota, Colombia. And we have also Carla Pallavicini, who is a neuroscientist working on consciousness. He works at the CONICET, the same research institution where Francisco and I work, but he belongs to a lab who that is called the Kokuko lab. It's like a weird kind of name. And then we finally have Melanie Rosen, who's also a philosopher working on dreams, on philosophy of dreams. And she has already presented before. She works at Trent University in Canada. And that's it. So Glenn, before Glenn starts the presentation, Francisco, who is doing some experiments on the out-of-body experiences, is going to do a short presentation about this kind of experiences. And then Glenn will talk about his paper. And then we have the comments of the panel. And then we are going to open the discussion to the general public. So that is going to be the kind of format of the talk, of the session today. Francisco?
Hello? Hello? Okay. Well, am I seeing this? This? Okay, yes. Well, I will be doing a brief introduction over the neuroscience of out-of-body experiences. I work in Sueño y Memoria labs in Elitba. And what is an out-of-body experience? The common definition of out-of-body experience is the sensation of being outside our own body, and perceiving the environment from this other external perspective. This is a definition from Irwin that is a very basic definition. Usually the out-of-body experience is extremely diverse, and they can experiment different feelings with different intensity. And usually they are reported as a three-dimensional and incredibly vivid experience. In words of Susan Blackmore, with the perceptual qualities of veridical perception. Susan Blackmore is a researcher in this area, a very famous one, that actually not only is a researcher in this topic, but also she experienced for herself out-of-body experience with quite frequency, so she knows what she's talking about. Well, out-of-body experience occurs in patients with, in some patients with neurological conditions such as epilepsy or migraine, but it can also occur in healthy population. It is estimated that 10% of the healthy population experience out-of-body experience once or twice in their lifetime. So it is a phenomenon that occurs, but it is extremely rare, as you can see, and this makes out-of-body experience research quite difficult. Well, out-of-body experience can be induced, in a sense, with drugs, and in particular dissociative psychedelics such as DMT and ketamine. And they can be induced also by sensory deprivation or sensory overload. And for example, in floating tanks, I don't know if anybody knows what a float tank is. It's a kind of a bathtub with salt water when you float there, and you don't have it's an enclosure space, so you don't have visual stimuli, neither you can hear anything, and you are floating, so you don't experience gravity the same way, and this lack of sensory input can induce a kind of distortion over the perception of your own body. And it can also occur in too much stimulation, for example, in torture or in experiencing extreme pain. It can also occur in electrical stimulation of some parts of the cerebral cortex area, such as the temporoparietal junction. And it can also occur in a spontaneous way from sleep paralysis, for example, or in meditation or in near-death experience. Well, by direct brain stimulation, maybe the first, or at least to my knowledge, the first register of a report of somebody leaving their body was by Wilder Pinfield, which is a neuroscientist, in that he stimulated one part of the cerebral cortex of a patient, and the patient exclaimed, "Oh my God, I'm leaving my body." No? And more modern works from the lab of Olaf Blanke and other researchers and collaborators and report several cases of this kind of stimulation in different areas. This is a famous case from 2002, in which this was a woman, in which whenever they stimulated in these two electrodes, the woman experienced an out-of-body experience, and with different intensity of stimuli, she could experience different somatosensory illusions, such as the feeling of falling down or floating in the air, or maybe even seeing a limb in front of her. So in a sense, this experiment proved that this kind of out-of-body experience could be induced by stimulating certain parts of the brain. No? There's another interesting experiment in which, by Smith and Messier, that they register in an fMRI machine a participant that actually could induce herself out-of-body experiences voluntarily, and they asked her to get out of her body and do some motor exercise out of the fMRI machine, and she did so, and they compare the activity of the brain in this state of being exercising out of her body versus being imagining the same motion. No? And what they found was different areas that are active, but the area that I was showing later, the temporoparietal junction, was activated. So what is the temporoparietal junction? Well, it's a portion of the cerebral cortex. It's a multisensory association cortex. This means that it incorporates information from different cortex cortexes and elaborate a response. No? In this case, it incorporates information from the thalamus, the visual and the auditory cortexes, and the somatosensory systems. No? And it is believed, or it is proposed, that this temporal parietal junction is in a way responsible for the emergence of a concept or a complex cognition feature that is the embodiment. I believe Glenn is going to talk more about it, so I would just say that embodiment is the sense, the perception of having and manipulating a body, no? And perceiving the self within the limits of that body. No? Well, one of the propositions is that OBEs, out-of-body experience, are the result of some alterations, in these cortices. In a very simplistic way, we can say that we may have some networks that manage the sense of body ownership, and other networks that manage the sense of self-location. And whenever these two networks are interchanging information in a coherent way, you can experience what is normally known as in-body experience. And whenever these two networks came in manage information that is not coherent, you start to experience somatosensory illusions, and if it is incoherent enough, you can experience something that complex as a out-of-body experience. Well, as I told you earlier, out-of-body experience can happen from sleep paralysis. So sleep paralysis is a brief period at the beginning or the end of the sleep, during which the person is unable to move or to speak while remaining awake and aware of the environment. No? The theory says that it consists of an intrusion of REM sleep into consciousness, into wakefulness. So in this state, you have several features of wakefulness, but some of the REM features came to you. So for example, the immobility. And the vast majority of persons that experience sleep paralysis experience different types of hallucinations. I'm not going to go deeply about them, but you have the intruder, that is the sense of a presence in the room next to the bed, usually. The incubus, which is a physical assault. You can feel somebody grabbing your feet, or somebody pushing or making pressure on your chest. And the third one is an out-of-body experience. So this person can actually get up from bed, get out of their body, and stop feeling the sleep paralysis, the immobility of the sleep paralysis, and from there on experience a three-dimensional experience, which is out of their body, and they can also, in some cases, even see their own body laying on bed. There is something really interesting about this kind of experience from sleep paralysis. In my opinion, they are different from the ones that are induced by direct stimulation of the brain. They seem to be more complex and more profound. Actually, there are several instructions and tutorials if you look forward in internet about this type of phenomenon. So there is people that actually want to experience this kind of out-of-body experience. This make me wonder if it is true, the basic idea that the researchers that study out-of-body experience with subjects in the surgery room that they talk about this experience as a failure, as a dysfunction, no, over the function of embodiment, no. And if you ask anyone who is looking for having this kind of experience, they would tell you that actually it is an opportunity, no, or an ability. Well, I don't want to steal more time for the talk, so that's all I wanted to tell. I'll stop sharing now and leave everything else to Glenn.
Okay, thanks for that, Francesco. I think I can skip over large parts of my talk now. Hopefully we'll have time for the interesting stuff. So thanks, Marina, for inviting me to talk. Thanks to everyone for running the session in English as well, being incredibly Australian. I can't speak anything else. Now, my first note here says, say hi and make excuses for the poor quality talk. So I just wanted to acknowledge that to everyone and let you know that I'm not actually working at the moment. I've been on mental health leave for about a year and a half. So this is a bit of a test for me. So if I start being incoherent or you know, I start struggling, it's because I'm not really in the zone. Beg a little bit of indulgence and patience. Disclaimer aside, we'll try and get going. So for those who don't know me, I'm Glenn. I use gender neutral pronouns, but most people use male pronouns. For me, I don't really mind. I should acknowledge as well that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Biripi Nation, land that was never ceded, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So I like to place this project in a little bit of context. My work has mostly been on theories of consciousness, in particular cognitive, with less to do with the neural underpinnings. But we'll get to that later on. So this paper was part of a project, you know, how do we explain consciousness, that culminated in a book which did the same sort of stuff, but sort of more from a pathological rather than, you know, ordinary hallucination perspective. So why are OBEs sort of interesting to this approach to consciousness? Well, I think because they're kind of weird self-experiences, and I'd taken up self-consciousness as like my example rather than because that had, you know, sort of been done to death by the time I was starting. So they're kind of aberrant self-experiences, or, you know, less common self-experiences. So I think that variation gave us something interesting to try and explain. Now, for this particular argument, I had a starting question, which was, how do we distinguish valid reports of experiences from what I'm going to call confabulations? So valid reports of experience are just when people accurately state what they experience. Confabulation, I want to expand on a little bit because it's a bit different to how the term is used in memory research, although it is related. to that. So confabulations, by confabulation here, I mean that additions that subjects make to the reports of their experiences in a way to try and make sense of the strange experience that they've had. So it's not something that, you know, they actually experienced, but it appears in their report because that helps them make sense of what they actually experienced. Now, I'm not committing at any point to saying such and such reports are valid and some are confabulations. Ultimately, what I'm going to try and convince you of is that there's no real difference between valid reports of experience and confabulations. All right. Out-of-body experiences are a tricky sort of set of experiences to examine because a lot of the data that we have on them, the reports come in, you know, months or years after the experience was actually had. Sorry, I'm just getting the power for this because it's telling me it's going to go off. Can you get plug on it? Like that. Sorry about that. I'm new to wireless headsets. So that was the starting question, right? So how do we use these reports where people say, you know, I felt like I was outside of my body, to, you know, did they, you know, they have experience, and then we'll look at some other examples and people will say things like, I was in outer space, or I was traveling down the highway to Frankfurt or something like that. And we go, well, we don't get those sorts of reports very often. They're not what we get in lab conditions. So, for example, in the Blanque study that Francesco, you mentioned, people were very much sort of within the room where the experiment was occurring, and not, you know, saying, you know, things like I was in outer space or I was flying down the highway or things like that. So, you know, how do we know that whether or not people are having those experiences in that case of travel, or whether or not that's just the story that you say because it makes sense that you should be able to do that once you're outside of your body. All right, so we've seen one example of variation in out-of-body experience reports there. That was in terms of travel. Another one that was mentioned before is in terms of self-seeing. Very often people report seeing themselves and, of course, various aspects of their environment, but this isn't universal to out-of-body experience reports. Some people don't see themselves. Some people only see their environment. Sorry, just let me plug this in.
All right, can you hear me now? Yep, okay. Sorry about that. In general, sort of coming to a few numbers, because, you know, we like to put numbers on things. In Blackmore's study that Francesco again mentioned, 46% of those subjects didn't notice their body during the experience. 8% reported trying to find it and not seeing it. 24% reported seeing their body and looking like their body or how they thought it was at that time. And 18% reported seeing it, but there being some variance in it. So the example that comes to mind is from Blanca et al.'s study again, where following the stimulation of the TPJ, one of the subjects reported seeing their bodies, but their limbs were extending and contracting. So there's some, variance between the experience and what the body is really doing at the time. So we're getting here, different kinds, we might call them, of out-of-body experiences. Some which involve a lot of visual experience. I should say that in his interviews, Terhune found that 32% of people reported having no visual experience at all during the out-of-body experience. They just felt like they were out and away, but they couldn't see anything. So we have a kind of like core phenomenology to the out-of-body experience, which Francesco, you sort of picked that up with the definition from Irwin, was that just this experience of being separate from the body. But there's also a lot of what seems to be elaborate phenomenology, quite detailed hallucinations. Sometimes visual, very often vestibular, so involving rotation sensations. Sometimes, there's quite elaborate reports of what's going on with the body at the time. So we have one report, this is from, sorry, I don't have the reference for it, but we have one report from a woman in a car crash. She had an out-of-body experience, and she experienced herself as coming out of her body and floating above the car, and then seeing her other body get up, so from the location of her real body, get up and walk around the car and come back in to where she was after the crash. There's also quite a lot of variance in how people experience themselves as this thing that's external from their body. Sometimes it's just a point in space. Sometimes it's a complete whole new body. It can be something in between. So we have from this subject who reported traveling to space, she reports sort of feeling like a body. But then when trying to look down and around, she sees that she has no legs, but otherwise she seems to have felt like she was a complete body. All right, so there's lots of different ways we might explain these experiences, explain these reports. I think that those explanations can exist on a kind of continuum between two extreme hypotheses. One I'm going to call the core phenomenology plus confabulation hypothesis, and the other is the elaborate phenomenology hypothesis. The core phenomenology plus confabulation hypothesis would say all that subjects really experience is this sort of defining feature of out-of-body experiences. They experience themselves as separate from their body. That's it. Everything else that we get in the reports is a story they tell to try and make sense of this weird experience of not being in your body. At the other extreme, we have the elaborate phenomenology hypothesis, which says subjects really experience everything that they report, and perhaps more, because we know subjects tend not to report vestibular sensations unless they're directly asked about them. So on that view, you're saying the experience is hugely rich and complex. There's no confabulation going on at all. People don't need to add anything in to their reports to try and make sense of the experience because they have such a rich experience. Now, I'm going to try and convince you that there's no difference between these options, that they actually amount to the same thing. Whether or not I can fit that complete argument in today might be a bit of a struggle, but what I'm going to do is at least try and convince you that there's no way to empirically distinguish these options, and that this creates a problem for a class of cognitive theory of consciousness, which is called vehicle theory. I'll come back to what that is in a bit. Okay, so where I'm going with this, what evidence could exist, or what evidence does exist currently that could distinguish this core phenomenology, the rest is confabulation, from this elaborate phenomenology hypothesis? I think there are three sources of evidence which are relevant here. There's direct evidence that we could look at in terms of how out-of-body experiences are constructed. There's indirect evidence in considering how they're constructed. Direct evidence in the reports themselves, and further indirect evidence by looking inside the brain. And when I say that, that's going to get a bit weird, and I'm going to be considering some, essentially science fiction scenarios about what we would like to be able to measure rather than what we can actually measure. So starting first with the construction of experience, people might favour the view that there's a lot of confabulation going on in OBE reports because of how theory-based the reports seem to be. So we have correlational studies that show things like people who have out-of-body experiences are more dissatisfied with their bodies and more anxious about their appearance than controls. We have one experiment, which was an imaging experiment, but I won't go through that data, but there one experiment with one subject who was a frequent OBE, so someone who had quite a lot of out-of-body experiences, and they were much, much better at mental rotation than control subjects. We also find things like people who have out-of-body experiences are more likely to believe in life after death and extrasensory perception and other, psychic phenomena than people who don't have them. So one possibility would be that these pre-existing skills and beliefs and attitudes influence the construction of an out-of-body experience. And because of that, we might go, well, this sort of theory-driven stuff looks more like confabulation than experience. This wouldn't be a very good argument, though. Of course, the first thing to point out is that a lot of these findings are correlational, and that having an out-of-body experience could plausibly change your belief about things like life after death. We know Metzinger, for example, has put forward the hypothesis that out-of-body experiences are where the idea of a soul comes from. I'm not saying we should be convinced by that argument, but the direction of causality from these studies could be from OBE to believing in life after death and not the other way around. More strongly, though, than this, I think both of the sort of extreme hypotheses we're considering would need some additions to explain these findings. Even if we could show not just that there's a correlation between these beliefs and out-of-body experiences, but that they're prior to and cause out-of-body experiences, either hypothesis needs an account of how needs an account to accommodate this. Because we could say that they play a role in the construction of a narrative, or they could play a role in the construction of experience. Neither of those options are ruled out, and neither are really accounted for just on these hypotheses alone. We need further theory for either one. And indeed, I would suggest that our preference for one hypothesis or the other, so whether or not we think there's a lot of confabulation or none, determines whether or not we're likely to see things like a belief in a life after death as having a role in constructing an experience or a confabulation. So I don't think this sort of consideration can distinguish between our hypotheses. Perhaps then we just look at the reports that we have from people who have had out-of-body experiences. Now, in particular, we might want to look at not reports that we get from people, months, years after the experience, because we think, well, there might be a lot of filling in, a lot of memory changes there is with any memory. For those, let's have a look at the reports from people who've had experiences induced in the lab. Now, either of our views, the confabulation or no confabulation views, are compatible with what we know about this, because we already know that it's not just the core phenomenology, not just I'm out of my body, that's induced in these circumstances. In the Blanco study, we see quite detailed reports of visual experience and of self-seeing. So the natural reading then might be to think those experiments favour the elaborate phenomenology hypothesis. We're inducing stuff that's seems to be quite an elaborate experience, so that's the way we should go. But the advocate of the sort of more confabulation-driven view could argue that in the experimental setting, we're changing people's experiences by asking about them. So in asking the subject we say, what are you experiencing now? In order to answer that question, the subject needs to come up with a coherent report. People don't want to say my experience is gibberish, they want to try and give an account. And so there's a place where confabulation could come in here in trying to give a coherent response. All right. I think more strongly, though, for my claim that there's no real difference between these extreme views, is that this sort of argument, I don't think, is contingent on studies like Blanque's turning out to be easily replicable or anything like that. I think whatever subjects report in experimental conditions, either of these apparently different hypotheses could account for them. So suppose we had some other experiments which seem to induce only the thin phenomenology, only the core phenomenology. I feel like I'm out of my body, but I can't see anything. I don't feel like I'm moving, etc. The elaborate, that sort of result, if that occurred, would seem to favour the confabulation hypothesis. But the elaborate phenomenology hypothesis the advocate of that could just say, well, you're asking about the experience too early. It's not fully constructed yet. It's just starting to occur in this. People aren't, building the rich experience. To use Dennett's language, the probe has come too early and fixed the content of the experience before it's, richly elaborated. So my point here is that reports can't distinguish these apparently different hypotheses. We have, we've had a couple of sources of evidence, looking at the theory, how theory-driven reports of OBEs are, and looking at, experimental induction of OBEs. Neither of these, I think, can distinguish between the view that there's a lot of confabulation and the view that there is none. So our next option would be to look at brain imaging evidence. Now, because I get to be a philosopher, I'm going to ask us for a bit of indulgence, and I'm going to ask us to imagine some future time where we're not so limited in our brain imaging techniques, but that we have the capacity to identify every representing vehicle in the brain. So we could identify particular patterns of activity across a particular neural network and say, we know that that activity is a representation of visual experience of a guitar, because everyone has guitars in their room today, or what have you. Now, this is a difficult act of imagination. I don't think this is as demanding as some of the acts of imagination that philosophers sometimes ask us to engage in. So we're not saying, imagine someone who knows everything about color vision. We're just saying, what if we could measure what we'd ideally like to measure? Now, if we could do this, there's one set of theories of consciousness called vehicle theories of consciousness that say consciousness is a particular medium of representation in the brain. So if you're familiar with quality space theory, this is a vehicle theory of consciousness. It says that consciousness is representation using points within quality spaces. Connectionists can be quite fond of this approach as well. They'll say that consciousness is a pattern of activity across a single layer of units. Now, if we were sort of convinced of that approach in general to consciousness, and we had the future brain scanner that we're imagining, we could go, cool, let's find all of the things that the subject is representing during an out-of-body experience, and we'll be able to see which representations are conscious, that are in the right medium, and which ones aren't. So if we accepted that vehicle theory and we had this idealized technology, it would be possible in principle to tell what's in the out-of-body experience and what's a confabulation. So we'd be able to distinguish the hypotheses, right? I'm going to suggest not. because the theory that we've thrown in there to try and make sense of the imagined data is not neutral as to this apparent distinction between the lots of confabulation and the no confabulation views. So vehicle theories, I think, are only consistent with the view that there is no confabulation going on in out-of-body experiences, or indeed in any experience. The reason for this is that all a vehicle theory can allow for distinguishing conscious from unconscious phenomena is the intrinsic properties of a representing vehicle. So none of the relational properties can play a role in distinguishing conscious from unconscious representations. So this really creates a problem, I think, for accounting for confabulations. So some, sort of possibilities for a vehicle theorist to say what's a confabulation would be to say, well, confabulations are conscious experiences. We don't have a representation in the right medium of visual experience of the body, say. But we do have a representation of that in the language production system. But that won't work for the vehicle theorist to make a distinction, because, in order to report something, there needs to be a representation of it in the language production system. That has to be the case for any report. Now, then we might say, well, okay, so there's a report, a representation of I'm seeing my body in language production systems, but that's not caused in the right way. It's not connected to a visual representation, say, of the body. Problem with this for the vehicle theorist is that this isn't a vehicle theory proposal, because it's considering the relations between particular representing vehicles. So between a representation in visual systems, somewhere in the striate cortex, say, assume that sort of thing turns out to be right. It's considering the causal relationship between that and representations in the language production system, and not intrinsic properties of the vehicles. So we're no longer looking at a pure vehicle theory. So the general problem here for the vehicle theorist is to say something internally consistent about what confabulation is. And it seems, at least to me, that they can't give an internally consistent account. They need to add considerations that go beyond the vehicle theory commitments. Now, because of this, I think if you're committed to a pure vehicle theory, which we were in the thought experiment earlier, you have to end up assuming the elaborate phenomenology hypothesis, because there's nothing you can do to say something could be a confabulation, because you can't specify what confabulations are on this kind of approach. All right, so starting to wind up, what I'm trying to suggest at the moment is that not only can we not distinguish between lots of confabulation and no confabulation on data that exists, even if we're imagining idealized evidence that we would like to collect, it wouldn't distinguish these hypotheses. Okay, so it's kind of up to the rest of you where you would like me to go from here. I could fill out a bit of an argument about why a functionalist approach, like why a global workspace theory type approach could, fits better with this inability to distinguish what are apparently two different hypotheses, or we can end it there and go to questions. So up to all of you, what would you like?
I think maybe we can start the discussion, Glenn. It's not because it's not interesting enough. It's more because maybe we have already spent 1 hour, so we can just start. And then if the topic about the functionalism comes out, we can discuss about it. But maybe you just want to round up the idea and then we can start the discussion. So if you want to say some words to...
Yeah, so I think what I've argued is that when we look at out-of-body experiences, we see a lot of variation in the nature of the experience. We want to account for that variation, and there's a couple of ways that we could do that. One is to say people have really different experiences. That's the elaborate phenomenology hypothesis. The other is to say people have very similar experiences, very minimal experiences, and then tell different stories in order to try and make sense of it. And that's the sort of core phenomenology plus confabulation view. Now, what I've tried to argue is twofold. That none of the evidence that we have at the moment can distinguish those apparently different hypotheses. And then more strongly that in principle, no evidence that we could acquire would distinguish those hypotheses, because how we interpret that evidence depends on the theory of consciousness we're already committed to. I had a look at what the vehicle theories were committed to, and we see that that theory isn't neutral as to whether or not people having out-of-body experiences are confabulating, or whether or not they're having rich experiences. So there's no, if you like, non-question begging way to interpret even idealized, imagined evidence that would distinguish these accounts. And so there really isn't a difference between hypothesizing that subjects who have out-of-body experiences have rich experiences, and hypothesizing that they just tell stories, interesting, rich stories about them, but actually only have a very small experience of being separate from the body. Hopefully that made some sort of sense. I know my thinking at the moment isn't entirely linear, but yeah, I can try and clear anything up. Any questions that you have?
So thank you very much, Glenn, for the talk. And if we have time, maybe, if there are not so much discussion, we can continue with the part that is missing. But I propose that maybe that we start maybe with the panel, the panel of, and maybe Melanie or Carla, Alejandro, I don't know who wants to start. You can do a comment, you can ask a question, you can discuss between you, so it's quite free.
I have no problem starting. I don't know if my colleagues would want to start, or if they have any questions. So I would like to start by saying, like, lovely talk and a really interesting paper. I read it today, this morning, so it's really fresh in my mind. And I actually wrote down a couple of questions, like, of course, more like things that get me thinking. And I would like to maybe pick your brain on how you define certain things, or maybe disambiguate some terms in my head of how things are meant in your paper, because you talk about hallucinations, imagination, and experiences as three different things, in a sense. Now you have this beautiful phrase that I actually wrote it down, that it says the act of imagination that later becomes indistinguishable from memory. I love that phrase. But like in this, even in the core plus confabulation, theory, the core, like the being outside of oneself, if we take like the physicalist standpoint of consciousness, we know that consciousness is inside our brain, and there is no way that we are outside of ourselves, like in reality. So actually, even the core is an imagination or an hallucination. So I would like to see if how we could like mix the or disambiguate this with the experience, or actually ambiguate it with the experience, because I think they are kind of the same thing. And if we if we accept hallucinations, for example, in like what you mentioned in your paper, LSD or ketamine or any other psychedelic for the matter, and we accept them as actual experiences, why wouldn't we accept like the whole hallucination of the out-of-body experience as an experience that is an hallucination? I don't know if I was clear, or if you think you could talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 points there. I want to do the definitions first. So I would consider both hallucinations and imagination to be kinds of experience. So that's the sort of relationship there. We have the superordinate category experience, and then heaps of things go into that. 2 of those are imagination and hallucination. So the difference between an imagination and a hallucination, as I'm using the terms here, is a matter of agency. So if it's an imagination, it's something that the subject is doing on purpose. So if I'm imagining being separate from my body, I can't do this very well, but I'm sure people with richer imaginations than mine can imagine themselves outside of their body, but it's something that they're doing. You feel in control of it. A hallucination is then something that the subject doesn't do on purpose, and sort of, I guess, from an experiential point of view, more is just lacking this feeling of agency. So it feels like something that happens to the subject rather than something they do. Is that a satisfactory distinction, do you think?
Yes, but like it was like more in the sense also of like the confabulation as an as an imagination. Does confabulation have agency? Is it an imagination? Is it?
Yeah. So so confabulation, it would be something that the subject does, but the difference here is that would just try, it's a more specific act. So it's like, I'm having an experience. How do I tell a story about that gets it across to you? So it's analogous to filling in gaps in memory. And, so we can have, classic false memory studies. We think you had a surgery when you were 5. Tell us about it. I didn't have that, come back a week later to tell a story. It's that same sort of thing. It's something that is actively done by the subject, but they don't realize how false it is. So it's, honest it's an honest attempt to try and put things together in a way that makes sense. Because I think that, we have evidence that even our normal ongoing perceptual consciousness is quite fragmented. Example that Dennett and both Switchgable use a lot with you've probably seen this with the playing card, hold it behind your head, bring it round, and it's only, once it gets to within the angle that gets the fovea that you can actually tell the color if you're holding your eyes still. So I think that, we have from these sorts of experiments evidence that our consciousness is quite fragmented, but it seems sort of unified to us. One sort of reasonable hypothesis about that is that it seems unified because we tell a good story that fits it together. Not saying that I think that that's right, but that's another sort of analogy for what I'm thinking of as confabulation in this circumstance. Right, so it's quite Dennettian. I don't know if that's too old-fashioned for everyone now, but I'm quite into it.
No, for me, it's perfect. I have a lot of questions, but I would like somebody else to speak, so I'm not the only one stealing the time here. And you can come back to me if there is more time.
Yeah, we'll come back to the, we'll come back to your second point, yeah. Yeah.
I could go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to shock and amaze you by saying that when I was reading your paper, I was doing kind of a comparative analysis with dreaming. One trick pony. But on the other hand, I think...
well, your very similar argument is cited at the start of the paper.
Yes, yeah. So in a little bit more detail to do a bit more analysis, because I think the analogy is a good one to do, because there's so much similarity between OBEs and dreams. So the memory issues related to how well we remember the experiences. With dreams, it's a little more extreme because you have that presumably, unless I'm wrong here, more extreme shift of neural activation, neuromodulation, and generally we forget almost all of our dreams. So very extreme forgetting going on. The weirdness of the experience.
It depends when the OBE occurs. So if you have the sleep paralysis ones or the ones associated with trauma, you sort of expect quite a big sort of shift between, sometimes unconscious, as in knocked out state. So if we're talking about the car crash ones, people can be knocked out and then have the OBE and stuff. So you can get that, but not universally.
Yeah. Also, I mean, in dreams we can have OBEs, so or replication. There seems to be some phenomenal similarity, bizarreness, and the like. The skepticism, which I think you're one of the more skeptical arguments towards OBEs, whereas dream skepticism has a bit of a longer history. I noticed that. So Dennett's. So the two main skeptical dudes for the dreams are Malcolm and Dennett. So Malcolm being very skeptical, saying that we just, for lack of a better word, make shit up when we wake up, and Dennett trying to have some kind of potential explanation for why would we make things up while we wake up. Well, there's this cassette theory. So for those of you who don't know, he hypothesized that we might have some kind of unconscious activation that creates a cassette which is replayed as a memory when we wake up, and then we believe that we've had a dream. So that would be, in their view, is a type of confabulation. I don't know if you would consider that a type of confabulation. or if that doesn't fit into your, it's an entirely false memory, and we're just reporting a false memory, but not trying to,
Okay, so is it worth me saying something on that now? Because I think that's not, I think that sort of extreme skepticism, I do say a bit of this somewhere in the paper. I think the extreme skepticism doesn't really work with OBEs. I don't think it really works in dreams either. But yeah, this sort of view is possible with OBEs, that it's just a story, there's no actual experience. I think it doesn't work because our common criteria for when a report counts as valid seem to be met for OBEs. And I think that there are two criteria that really matter here. One is inducibility. So can we produce the experience through an experimental interference? And we can do that with drugs, and we can do it with TMS. So that criteria is met. The other is the criteria I call clustering, which is that there's some sort of thematic organization to the experience. So all OBEs are obviously organized around the theme of being separate from the body. That's the defining feature. But we also have other sort of clusters, some that have visual experiences, some that don't, some that have experiences of travel, some that don't. These sorts of things. Now, that criteria of clustering is one that we apply a lot in psychiatric symptoms. So we're happy to say that people with delusions of thought insertion actually experience thoughts as being inserted into their head because there's this clustering of their reports around that theme. And so I think that by analogy, if we're happy to accept those sorts of reports, we should accept, at the very least, a sort of minimal people really experience themselves as separate from the body. So I don't think that kind of skepticism, which has so much, play from Dennett and Malcolm, can really be applied to OBEs.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. However, could it be possible, this made me think, that your core plus confab view could be an explanation for dreaming? I can't think of what the core might be, however. That would be very interesting if it were true. So my kind of, as you know, as Glenn knows, my kind of willingness to go along the confabulation route for dreaming is that there's no core per se, but there's some kind of experience, and we confabulate to a large extent in some cases for various reasons. So if you were to apply a similar kind of view to OBEs, except you have this core, which you've given some interesting arguments for, then you'd have core plus varying levels of phenomenal additions plus confabulation. So that wasn't a view that was discussed too much in the paper, but I would probably side with that view, given the difficulty of explaining, well, why is the confabulation going on so specifically? So, I mean, I'd expect some kind of confabulation, like, let's say you see something that's bizarre, and then you wake up and you confabulate about what you saw. So you're wrong. You saw something, but what you're reporting is not really accurate. Rather than, oh, I didn't see anything, I'm going to make up some visual stimulus, which seems to be the case if you have a core plus nothing, and then you confabulate visual stimulus after your OBE. What would explain that specific confabulation in which you add a full kind of type of phenomenal stimulus?
Yeah, so the reason why I didn't consider that sort of view so much in this argument is that I consider that to be a view that lies on the continuum between the hypotheses I did consider. Because what I wanted to achieve, or what I thought the argument was doing in this paper, was saying that there's no difference between the extreme views. I didn't think it was so relevant to consider the positions in between, because if we can't tell apart the extreme views empirically, then the ones in between, we can't tell them apart either. That follows from it being a continuum. So that's why I didn't do that. I do think, though, that if someone were to advocate the core plus confabulation view, that's the sort of thing that would be more realistic than the extreme view I considered here. In particular, I think people would really distinguish between, because Terhune has this fascinating finding that heaps of people don't actually report visual experiences from it. So they'd at least distinguish between I'm seeing something and I'm seeing not, and say these are distinct cores, if you like, that explain different elaborations through confabulation, for sure. But given, I think that it ended up being an argument that, these views aren't actually different, and this is quite a Dennettian conclusion, that, because the extremes aren't different, and nothing in between them is actually a distinct view either.
I have other stuff to say, but I guess we can rotate and see if there's more time, because we've been chatting for a while now.
Yeah, I have two comments, but I'm gonna go with the first, and the second round. Maybe I can make my second comment. But I would like you to elaborate a little bit more about why do you find that the functionalist theory fits better or fares better with the inability to empirically distinguish those two hypotheses that you were discussing? That's because, as I understood you, the idea was that vehicle theories are unable to explain the phenomena of confabulation, whereas the functionalist theories more or less are insensitive to the distinction between those two things. But what I was understanding at the beginning was that those two hypotheses are relevant to the extent that they tell us something deep about the very identity of the phenomenon. They tell us what those experiences are. So to what extent do the functionalist theories fare better if they say those two things that by that X hypothesis were two different things are, at the end of the day, are the same thing? So it's a way to fail to me. Like they're not faring any better than the vehicle theory. And maybe I'm not particularly a defender of the vehicle theories, but maybe you can find a way to say that, for instance, second order conscious states may be like difference of order can be explained as different vehicles, for instance. And maybe you have an explanation of things. Maybe you have an outline, at least. If you say that confabulations are are vehicles whose content are first order experiences. So it was that this broad point I would like the way you make your final assessment of those two theories. That's the one I want to.
Yeah, no, thanks. They're both really helpful points to probe the argument. I think I take the last point first about whether or not a vehicle theory can deal with confabulation by bringing in second order consciousness, second order representations. I think that that sort of account is the sort of thing that ends up not really being a vehicle theory, because it ends up really focused on the relationship between the second order and the first order state, and whether or not just, so if we were to say just the second order state has content and that's consciousness or so on, yeah, that's great. But whether or not that's a confabulation or whether that's experience depends on whether or not there's the first order state that also has that same content. So I think that what's doing the work is not just the intrinsic properties of the second order state, but the relationship that it bears to the first order one. So that's no longer a pure vehicle theory. That's a hybridized theory. Once we get into that, the issue for the argument is that just identifying representing vehicles in the brain isn't enough. We need to look at relationships as well. Why do you go into the first point there? Why do functionalist accounts sort of deal better with this? So I think you're right that where I start is this seems like something really important about out-of-body experiences, about the nature of them. Are they confabulations or rich experiences? That seems really important. But in the end, I'm saying that's merely an apparent difference. So you're right, that's the structure of the argument. Now, is that then a failure of functionalism if it collapses that distinction? I think yes. In one way, that is quite right. So in the book, which extends this argument, where I end up is that phenomenology is best explained by vehicles and awareness is best explained by functions. And so this sort of come back to this not really being a meaningful distinction in awareness, but being a meaningful distinction when considering phenomenal qualities. But phenomenal qualities need to be measured in a different way. So, I think this is in general a problem for functionalism, that it's as a sort of set of approaches, they're quite good at saying what is it for a particular representational content to be, for us to be aware of that. But what they're not very good at is things like, why is the most saturated blue more saturated than the most saturated yellow? Why are there more purples than oranges? Those sorts of odd features of phenomenal qualities, they're much better accounted for by vehicle theories. So I think that answers your question. Is it a failure of functionalism Yeah, and I think that, so ultimately I think that, you know, a hybrid view is the way to go. You know, I indeed, I don't think that there are many people around who are, there are plenty of pure functionalists, but I don't think that there are many people around who are pure vehicle theorists these days. I think O'Brien and Opie still are. I'm not sure if Bruce Mangan's still kicking around, but he was very committed to this sort of view. So I think it's a viable one. It was a viable one, but yeah. I don't know. Does that answer your question? I'm getting a bit rambling now.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It really answers. It goes beyond what I expected, and I like your answer. I would like to see your book. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I have a question, but maybe I would like to ask the panelists if they want to ask another questions or do some comments, because I know that Carla had more comments and Melanie as well and Alejandro. So maybe Carla, you can start if it's okay with you.
Yes, of course. I have no problem. Yes, I had, well, actually, like also circling around what Melanie said with comparing with dreams and that phenomenology, and the fact that it's very hard to imagine like inventing a whole visual stimulus, just confabulating the whole of it, or maybe just confabulating the representation of something you saw and can't explain. We also worked in our lab with narratives of near-death experiences, where OBEs are like one of the main characteristics. And what we did actually was compare narratives of near-death experiences with narratives of different drugs experiences with different kinds of drugs, psychoactive drugs, and through computational tools like latent semantic analysis, we found which drug-induced experiences were the closest, the most similar to near-death experiences. So the title of the paper is Neurochemical Models of Near-Death Experiences. What I'm trying to get to with all this is that what we found saliently, like with no doubt, that experiences with ketamine are the most similar to near-death experiences. And in particular, like one of the most salient experiences of ketamine experiences, sorry for the redundance, are OBEs. So I think ketamine is also a good neurochemical model for OBEs and could be used as like a proxy to of course, not all ketamine experiences will result in OBEs, but a fair good amount of them could. And this could be a vehicle to explore, like I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a physicist, so I'm more of a like go get data out of people kind of girl. But so you could study this and in a scanner and try to find these correlates, but particularly, for example, with the visual representations, with seeing yourself, seeing your body, or seeing the planet. If you could find a relationship between people that express having visual representations and an activation of the visual cortex, I think this could be kind of a beginning of a proof that this phenomenology is actually occurring in the brain and not only just being invented afterwards.
Yeah, so overall, I think I'm inclined to agree, but I think like a hardcore functionalist has a possible response to that, and that is that seeing activation in that part of the brain doesn't tell us anything more than the representational content is fixed. So that sets the content. So we know that the subject is representing that, but getting from what we represent to what we experience is the big step. So, this is, Dennett goes on about this, and he's like, sure, we've got the representation of the visual scene, then what happens? So I think, as I said in response to the previous question, I'm inclined to, sort of a hybrid view that you get the phenomenal qualities there, and then you do the global workspace sort of processing later on, and that's the awareness. But I think that the functionalists can accommodate that sort of data and still say, we don't know whether or not that's experienced. And they could point to things like, binocular rivalry and say, it looks like there's activation associated with both the face and the house in the visual cortex, but only one of those is experienced at a time. I'm not saying that's the right view. I just think that the functionalist has a story that they can tell to accommodate that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But, I don't want to just stand here and stick up for Dennett, but I think that they can manage it. Yeah.
Excuse me. I think that I can add something to that. Oh, sorry. Hello? I think I can add something to that question, and it's the fact that lucid dreams exist, or at least to our knowledge. They are lucid dreaming for the spectators are dreams in which we are conscious of being inside a dream, and in several cases they can resemble wakefulness. And in OBEs, we have reports that people said that they have awareness at the same level of the waking experience. So if we cannot resemble or trust the experience, the perceptual experience, what can we say about the conscious state during these experiences?
Can you hear me now? I'm off mute. Yeah, cool. I'm definitely inclined towards that sort of view that we should trust the reports. I mean, I think if you look at where these sorts of worries coming from are sort of switch gable style skepticism about introspection, and saying things like, even in our normal, I mentioned this before, even in our normal sort of ongoing visual experience of the world, it seems like we have this, so rich, detailed, fully colored to the edges experience, but there's evidence that it's not like that. People point to change blindness, people point to, the card experiment and so on. And so the sort of skepticism, I think, about OBE reports doesn't have to be specific to OBEs. It can be a general skepticism about our inability to accurately report our experiences. Now, I'm not saying that's the right view, but I do think that that is a view that is on the table in the literature. And if we, apply that sort of general introspective skepticism to OBEs, then we end up with something like the core phenomenology plus confabulation view. And it seems like that should be empirically distinguishable from the view that, you're saying is, a much more natural view. But actually, being able to, distinguish those from existing data or as I've tried to argue, idealized imaginable data is, is much harder than it seems like it should be. So I think that despite the intuitive appeal of that position, we still end up circling back to how do we actually tell these views apart and whether or not that's possible. Yeah.
All right. My second point was kind of a clarification about the idea that the the futuristic brain scanner, which can't really distinguish between the two options. So let's say we have like a set period of time, an OBE happens, whatever that is. Let's assume in this particular case. So my view is probably going to be something like your core plus confabulation view happens sometimes, and other times it might be less confabulation. Like confabulation varies depending on various circumstances. But let's say we believe that at least some confabulation is going on. So you have some kind of OBE experiences with core plus maybe something else, maybe not. And then somewhat afterwards, there's an event which is like the memory gets recalled of that event. And then sometime after that, or maybe, coinciding, there's the report. And the confabulation process might be happening between the experience and the memory, or as the memory is being remembered, or the report may be where the confabulation happens. And then because we believe that people aren't lying, right? People believe what they're saying is accurate. The report then kind of does a feedback to the memory, and then it gets re-remembered with this new confabulated version. But if you had a brain scanner that could kind of tell you whether a memory was accurate, let's say. I'm assuming that this is not something you would allow. If you could just say, well, this memory is not accurate due to the brain scanner, that would solve your issues, wouldn't it? Or if a report was not accurate of a memory, maybe that's more tricky.
Yeah, I don't think it would. You might be able to sort of spin an argument and say, we've got reports straight after the OBE, and we've got reports 6 months later. There's stuff in the 6 month later one that's not in the first one, that's misremembered. We can drop that out. I think any of the hypotheses is fine with that. The elaborate phenomenology, unless you're a hardcore committed pure vehicle theorist, you can still say confabulation occurs. It's just saying it's not happening in these reports. Okay. Yeah. Except for the hardcore pure vehicle theorists, because they're saying there's no such thing as confabulation.
How does a hardcore vehicle theorist handle memory at all?
So it will treat memory as a distinct phenomena from phenomenal consciousness. So what's reported from memory is representational content, and that can be constructed in any number of ways. Mm-hmm. But what it isn't is constitutive of experience.
Okay, yeah, I've been doing a bit of reading of the memory literature, and that, I guess, that would be consistent with a non-causalist theory of memory, which memory isn't defined by some kind of causal relationship between an experience and re-experience.
So so one way this is done by O'Brien and Opie, who give us the term vehicle theory, is they say experience, because they're connectionists, they say experience is stable patterns of activation across a layer of units. Memory is representation stored dispositionally in connection weights. So that's the sort of thing that they're looking at, saying they're fundamentally different media of representation. Yeah. Okay, so the other point was Yeah. So in that circumstance, I think it's, again, sort of, it's helpful to look at that sort of story that you told about, going into memory and then back out from a sort of functionalist perspective, and how that could be understood. So if you take the broadest form of functionalism, which I think is Dennett's, where being a winning vehicle, being processed in as many ways as possible is what constitutes being conscious of it. All of those processes I think you're describing will be ways in which a particular representing vehicle or set of representing vehicles of, visual experience, I'm out of my body, et cetera, ways in which those become winning vehicles. So once they go into to consciousness, which are conscious, I should say. And so the view there, I think, would be what's different is not whether or not confabulation is occurring before or after something's experienced, but whether it's occurring relatively early in the process of being experienced or relatively late in the process of being experienced. And that is not a substantial difference, I think, for the functionalist. So what I find helpful in trying to get my head around these sorts of stories is sort of, how Dennett collapses the distinction between adding content to an experience and adding content to a judgment about the experience. I think that, the way to get our head around this sort of pure functionalist story here, it's quite helpful to think about that and go, it seems like there's a difference between adding content to a representation before it's experienced and adding content to just the judgment about that experience. But because forming the judgment is at least partially constitutive of it experiencing that initial content, we're just talking about where it occurs in the process that is consciousness. I don't know, I'm kind of running out of steam here, but I think that with these sorts of stories that seem like they can, distinguish things, there's always the risk of the functionalist coming along and saying, it's just a matter of when in the whole process content is changing. It's not, there's no before or after experience that is, easy to or possible to identify because, processing is temporarily extended. Is that making any sense? I feel like I'm rambling again. Cool.
Yeah. I had my last comment was regarding more like a possibility which could be like a methodological implication of your argument of the way you build the argument for the as I understand your paper, and you're trying to point to a form of underdetermination between those two hypotheses, isn't it? So understood this way, and taking into account that a couple of minutes ago we were talking about trusting the reports of the subjects, I was wondering if we can build some kind of skeptic argument for not to trust subjects' reports, because you could say, okay, maybe you can construct an argument similar to the one you have been discussing, you have been presenting, but regarding the core phenomenology of OBEs. So I was thinking, for instance, one can say that the core phenomenology amounts to feeling that you are separate from your body, but that's incredibly broad, right? That's incredibly general. What does it mean? So if you try to pinpoint that core phenomenology, maybe you can end up with alternatives that are not to be decided somehow by empirical data. So maybe you can like replicate this kind of underdetermination with the very core phenomenology. So you have a more skeptical argument about OBEs and about the very identity of OBEs. For instance, I was thinking, when you have the core phenomenology, you have two things. You have on the one hand the seen body, the body that you are seeing, if you are seeing. So how are we supposed to describe this experience? You can see, okay, I feel that seeing body as my own. That's one thing. And an alternative is, I see a body that looks just like mine, or that I just take as mine. And regarding the point of view, you have two alternatives. Like one is, I became disembodied. The other is, I am, for this moment, I am this thing located somewhere else in physical space, in a place other than my whole body. So, okay, that's the point is, maybe you can tell an underdetermination story about the core phenomenology, and maybe that's a way of saying, okay, you cannot really trust subjects' reports. You have to appeal to some methodological resources, as you were saying, like inducibility, stability.
Yeah, I strongly agree. I think that we want those independent criteria. Once you, because this is it's all through philosophy, right? Once you start doing skeptical arguments, you can end up being skeptical about anything. But I do think that we have, like you said, those psychological science criteria that seem to apply pretty well to the core phenomenology, and whether we're attracted to a general sort of skepticism about the core phenomenology depends on how happy we are with those criteria. And those are, I think things that are, we're not then just talking about, does the report seem like the sort of thing that could be an experience or something like that. I would suggest if we're not happy with those criteria, then we end up having to accept a very broad skepticism about experience. We could never accept that people with psychiatric symptoms experience the things that they say. We could never accept dreams. We could never accept reports in hypnosis. We could never accept reports of illusions. And I think my feeling is, if we start saying we're not happy with those criteria, we end up saying we're not sure. We don't think people have experiences at all. And I'm happy to accept, my epistemology is not a foundationalist epistemology. I'm happy to accept that there's no certainty as to whether or not someone has an experience, for sure. But I think that there is better evidence that people do than they don't. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think, that sort of skepticism about the core phenomenology, I think the argument is worth considering, but I think we have these criteria that we apply in other circumstances, and we seem happy to apply them in those circumstances. So why not to OBEs? And I'm not seeing anything sort of substantially different about OBEs that says, the criteria shouldn't apply. Does that at least explain where I'm coming from, if not do away with the skepticism?
I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Well, Francisco, do you have any question? Or someone else, maybe? I think someone just turned on. Okay.
Thing to work. Yeah. Oh, it's this simply continue right then. Can I just change the topic just a little bit? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. And thank you for those very good talks. I want to bring back to something that Francesco said in his first presentation, because it crosses a little bit with my work, my day-to-day work. So I'll just explain that I live here in Sydney, and that I work with refugees. It's a mental health institute for refugees and asylum seekers to Australia. And so what I do meet every day, well, not quite every day, but are people who have come through situations of torture. And one of the things that Francesca said was that some people who have gone through these sort of experiences have had OBEs during those sort of episodes. Is that right, Francesca? Yeah. And I thought that really struck me, because so what I do day to day is I have to see people, and one of the things I have to do is do an EEG on them. And so when they come into the clinic or into my room and I have to talk to them, I can't really upset them, because they've got to be relaxed. Okay. So I need to know something about their physicality, of where they've come from, whether they've had some sort of head injuries and things like that, without triggering any kind of flashbacks and things. So I have to be very delicate in what I have to ask people. So I've never asked anybody about OBEs, but I do get lots of stories from people who have had dissociation. In fact, people sometimes dissociate in front of me, and it's quite scary when that happens. So certainly with torture episodes, people dissociate. So they just simply do not feel that they're there, you see. So it's an interesting thing so that OBEs are related in some ways to dissociation, but it's a kind of more aware version of it, let's say. On the other side, Susan Blackmore and myself had a friend in common here in Sydney, who's no longer with us. He was an elderly person then, called John Wren Lewis, who was had both a scientific, like a mathematics background and a psychology background. And during the 60s, he's an Englishman, but he was in California, and he did all the drug experiences with the same doctor that did the drug experiments with Aldous Huxley. And so he had quite a range of drug experiences. But then later in his life, he was on a bus in Thailand, where children came on the bus and gave out lollies, sweets to people. And the idea was that they were laced with strychnine. And if you took the lolly, you fell unconscious, and then people would come and rob you, you see. And this happened to him. He kindly ate this sweet, and he then had a near-death experience, which went on for quite a long time. He was in hospital, etc. And he was able to report, as the psychologist, that this experience was way different to all the different drug experiences he'd had. And then from there on, it had changed his life. And he was in contact with Susan Blackmore, who'd, of course, written these books on this stuff. And they became quite friendly because she could talk to him about it in a more scientific way than some other people that had no background. So what I'm saying here now is that we've got OBEs in the middle, and we've got dissociation on one side, and then we've got near death on the other. But one thing that has come up during my listening to this whole seminar here, and I want to ask this as a strange sort of question. The other thing that people have when they have traumatic backgrounds, particularly if they're a child in an abusive situation as a child, is that they have later in life what we would more commonly call multiple personalities, which is a form of dissociation where they take on the personality of another person, and they can just become, they talk differently, they seem to do everything differently. Now, while on the surface, they may not seem to be that OBEs, where you're the same personality, but you're just not in your body. You're either, you're looking around or something, and that you're a multiple personality, you're taking on another personality. It seems to me that if you could explain one of these sorts of things, whether it's dissociation or something about near-death experiences, or even multiple personalities, that they're all of a kind of a very broad cluster. So what I want to ask you is, has anybody approached it from that point of view? Has anybody has anybody who's researching this brought those sorts of things all together?
I invite all people. So if someone, Glenn, if you want to answer, but also, I don't know, Melanie, Carla, Alejandro, Francisco.
I see what the commonality is.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah, if I just say what the commonality is, that when you have a very big traumatic experience, then some people just simply dissociate. Some people have an OBE. When somebody's near to death, they have something. And then if you've got a traumatic background, see the way that the child dealt with an abusive situation was by taking on another personality. So there's a commonality there in that broad sense. So, but there's probably more to it.
Yeah. So thanks, Peter. It sounds like you're doing really important work there too. So there's a couple of other things that I'd add to your list: depersonalization and derealization experiences as well. So the feeling that oneself is unreal, or the feeling that it can be a single object or it can be a whole environment is unreal. There's definitely some forms of OBEs which fit on this continuum, or maybe continuum's not the right word, maybe it's multidimensional, but yeah. So if I think about people that I've spoken to, this isn't published work, but people who have had OBEs associated with sexual assault, they report similar feelings of dissociation for self-protection that the kinds of subjects that you were talking about as children report. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to tie into spinning really broad narratives that give us separate senses of identity. although certainly that's the argument Dennett's pushed quite strongly from back when we called it multiple personality disorder. So there's a couple of considerations, I think, and this is discussed in the literature, is that OBEs can be a form of dissociation, and they definitely can be self-protective. But there are other reasons as well why people sometimes experience themselves as separate from the body. So sleep paralysis is one, and you have, I know like lots of people find sleep paralysis quite traumatic, but you have reports of from people who are, not traumatized by the sleep paralysis, and they say things like, I tried to roll and I rolled and I got out of bed, but my body was still there, and they clearly find it interesting rather than traumatic. So I don't think that every instance of an out-of-body experience can be placed in that the dissociative category, but there are definitely some that are. So it's kind of like, if we want a complete explanation of dissociation, we need to explain out-of-body experiences. But if we want a complete explanation of out-of-body experiences, we need to explain things other than dissociation as well. So yeah, I think where I'm ending up is that, yeah, it is a multi-dimensional space that we need to explain there, if that makes any sense.
Thanks.
I don't know if someone else wants to answer Peter's question or do some comments. Glenn, you wanted to say something, or?
I wanted to jump in to just make a little remark. Was it at the beginning, Carla was asking Glenn about confabulation, or about hallucination and imagination, and Glenn's answer was, roughly speaking, in terms of the role of the will, so to speak, in those two things. But I was thinking, and Peter's question made me think about that again, was about the concept of spontaneous imagination, in which you have a form of imagination which is not like intended, which is not like something that you're trying to do. So it complicates things, because you can think that sometimes something along the lines of spontaneous imagination or something similar is happening in cases of I don't know, OBEs, or some OBEs, for instance, as those which are associated with dissociation. So maybe we need like a more complex apparatus to understand the difference between imagination, confabulation, hallucination. And mostly because the difference cannot be put simply in terms of imagination and what, like making a story, somehow making a story, and something just happening to was just that.
So I think one relevant consideration there is I definitely glossed over this in my initial response, but the distinction between doing something intentionally and being the agent of it, which is I know an unsatisfactory distinction to some philosophers, but I think experientially they are distinct, because we do control things, and I think, you know, feeling like you're in control of something is like a really important part of the sense of agency. We do control things that we don't seem to be doing intentionally, in that, you know, we can do lots of automatic actions with our bodies. We don't feel like someone else is doing them to us, or that they're just happening, but we can't say what the intention behind it was, or we don't experience the intention before. So people talk about like flow experiences in playing music or playing sport, where the person is definitely, you know, in control of their shot or the thing that they're playing. If they weren't in control, the music wouldn't come out, or they wouldn't land the shot, what have you. But there's no experience of intention immediately proximal to that. So I think imagination can be like that as well. So seemingly, at least seemingly automatic, but still agentive. At least from an experiential point of view, because, you know, we don't feel like our imaginings are inserted from the outside, as people who have deficits in their sense of mental agency do sometimes feel like thoughts, voices, etc., it inserted from the outside. So I think the objection there came from me being sloppy in my initial presentation of what I thought imagination was. Yeah. If that helps, I don't know.
Well, I think we already have a lot of questions, right? So we spent 2 hours during this talk. It's great, Glenn. I think it was like a great talk, and all the panelists like Melanie, Carla, Alejandro, and Francisco, who did the presentation, and the participants also who were here. And well, so the next session is going to be quite different. So it's about memory, and it's not going to be too much related with consciousness, but more about epistemic injustice and this kind of stuff. So we want to thank all the speakers. So Glenn and Melanie and Francisco with the presentation, Carla, Alejandro, and the Sociedad Argentina de Investigaciones en Neurociencias, who is hosting this meeting. So that's it. Thank you very much for being here, and well, so see you soon, maybe.
Thank you all very much for listening, and great set of questions, and thanks for being tolerant of me not being at my best. Really appreciate that. It's great to have the opportunity to come and start talking again. Thank you all.
Thanks for organizing, Marina.
No.
Thank you all. Thank you for the talk and for inviting me.
No, yes, that's what I should have discovered you before to also present something, but well, maybe we can organize something in the future.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Alejandro. And well, some words about what is happening in Colombia. So thank you for being here. Well, there is a situation, a political situation in Colombia. So yes, the best of luck.
Thank you all. Thank you for Marina and Francisco for having me. Glenn for an awesome talk. This is a subject that passionates me very much. And Melanie and Carla for those insightful comments. Thank you all.